I thought the geologists and hydrologists need a chance.
Yeah, there you go. Can you see my screen okay?
Yep.
Great. Well, I'm going to focus today on floodplains as conservation opportunities. And by necessity, as the state geologist of Iowa, my area of field work is pretty much Iowa. But the issues, topics, and results that I'm going to show today really apply across the country, even to California that we've heard so much about. Quick little who we are. I'm just part of the Iowa Geological Survey. We're a unit of 12, 13 people in Iowa City at the University of Iowa. And so we do a lot of work across the state looking at natural resources and how to manage these for long-term sustainability and economic development. You know, like I said, alluvial corridors, floodplains line every river system in the world. And we're going to, again, focus in on Iowa. There's the state, and you can see the distribution of the alluvial aquifers, which is this sand and gravel deposits that form in conjunction with the stream migration. So rivers are conveyor belts for sand and gravel, and they deposit these in their floodplain. In Iowa, these are underlain by typically glacial materials, but they could be underlain by bedrock and other materials in other parts of the country. How we manage floodplains? Well, you know, typically they're the location where we had substantial urban development. So people settled along floodplains, they built buildings, changed drainages, put concrete up, and so forth. So we've really intensively managed floodplains for urban development, but even in agricultural states or regions across the country, they make fine locations for intensive cropland. So between the two, we just don't really have many examples of what natural floodplains are supposed to look like. We've really changed their character everywhere across the country. I'm going to start with a presentation on how floodplains are supposed to work, and then we're going to go into a little bit about what farming has done to floodplains, and then kind of come back to say how we can use these as conservation targets. So this is a pretty elementary picture of a floodplain, and you see all these great little floodplain features in a natural floodplain: bar and swale topography, meander scars, oxbows, point bars, etc. So these are the natural features that we see oftentimes. Again, imagine one of the locations that I've done a lot of work with in Iowa is a nature conservancy property located on the Cedar River, a large river flowing through eastern Iowa. It's called the land of the swamp white oak. So this is a natural floodplain area that has not been developed. And so it really offers this great opportunity to see how floodplains are supposed to work. You can see the INSAT map shows the Cedar River, and it shows a border around installed at the floodplain. We've done high resolution monitoring of groundwater conditions in the floodplain, and you can see it from this graph just over a 3-year period a few years ago, where stage in black showing the fluctuation of the river compared to the red, which is the fluctuation of the water table in the monitoring well located about a mile away from the river. You see how closely aligned they are, so shallow related to river stage. If we zoom in on just a single event, this is what the relationship looks like. The river stage goes up in blue. There's period, and then all away from the river increases the same. River stage goes down, and the water table in the floodplain eventually decreases too. Interesting feature here are these little squiggles before and after the storm event on in this central well. But they're very observable on floodplains, and where you get transpiration from plants, typically in this case these large swamp-like oaks, you see how the water table responds to this plant evapotranspiration. So every day, during the day, the water level in the water table decreases as the plants are transpiring water. Water's moving from the groundwater up the stems of the plant and out through the leaves. And then at night, the plant still is shut down. Water resists diurnal water table fluctuation in shallow groundwater and these floodplains. Of course, you see this in a lot of other places, but they are really prominent here. And you could add up every day, the water table will rise and fall and rise and fall. The difference between the height of that water table change every day, the decrease in that water table level, which is that delta H, that's proportional to plant evapotranspiration. So you can summarize all those daily changes in that delta H and get an idea of what the plant evapotranspiration is. And that's the box plot to the right, just showing every day for a 3-year period, we had essentially an estimate of what the plant ET was. Another feature that we've since investigated at this site was this interesting phenomena that I've never seen in the literal water table fluctuations. We see diurnal dissolved oxygen fluctuations. And what was interesting too is that diurnal DO was out of phase with the water table. So during the day, the water table decreases, but the dissolved oxygen increases. And at night, the water table responds back and increases, but the dissolved oxygen decreases. So it's an interesting phenomenon. And what we hypothesized was that we had transpiration during the day when water tables decrease, and at night, all those carbohydrates generated in the leaves were shuttled back down to the roots, and those roots leaked a little bit of these carbohydrates into the groundwater, and then all the bugs were very happy to chew up the excess carbohydrates and consume dissolved oxygen at night. So we'd never seen that before, but that was an interesting feature of the floodplain. So how does the floodplain water quality at all these wells at the Swamp White Oak site compare to the Cedar River? Well, the most obvious comparison is nitrate. That's in the lower left. The Cedar River, somewhere between 8 to 10 milligrams per liter, barely detectable in groundwater in the floodplain. But you see other features as well. I mean, we got high levels of dissolved oxygen in the flowing surface water, very low in groundwater at the Swamp White Oak in the floodplain, and so forth. So you do see on an end member basis, very big differences between the Cedar River and floodplain groundwater. If you summarized all this is interesting in terms of plant ET. You can see from the pie chart that essentially most of the ET occurs from May to August there. But if you summarize the amount of transpiration that occurred in a year, or during this growing season, about 400 millimeters a year, over the 150 hectare preserve, the amount of water being used by this floodplain is equivalent to a well pumping at 300 gallons a minute during this time. So
I missed what an ET is.
ET is evapotranspiration. So that is, it includes a little bit of soil evaporation, but it's mostly associated with transpiration by the vegetation. So it's the use of the water by the vegetation that's returned to the atmosphere through the leaves. So the vegetation pulls it out from the roots and then discharges it back to the atmosphere. If you think about the average concentrations and that water use, we really end up with a fair bit of nutrient and carbon sequestration going on. in this floodplain system. And that's a longer point I'm not going to dig into here. All right, so where does the water and nutrient processing occur? So we saw that there were differences in groundwater level, nitrate, and some of the nutrients. Well, we can look at these natural topographic variations here, this bar and swale topography and the meander scars. As the river moves back and forth across the floodplain, it will carve out a channel, and then on the other sides of it, it will leave a kind of an old cut bank, and we'll have this natural topography pick up. You can see it in the as a color-coded high resolution topographic map, this LiDAR map. You can see kind of this ridge and swale kind of topography, where the pinks are and browns are high elevation, the greens and the blues are lower. So if you did a cross section across this floodplain, A to A prime, what you'd get is ridges and swales and ridges and swales across this floodplain. And so what we did was install monitoring wells in both the ridges and the swales, and kind of set up a study design to see what sort of variation we might see and understand where more nutrient processing might occur on a floodplain. Part of that effort was to do some surface geophysics, and we walked around with this geophysical device, which measures essentially how conductive the ground is to a current. So if it's resistive from sand doesn't conduct electricity very well, or current very well, it's low. If you have more fine textured things like silt and clay, it's going to be more conductive. So we walked across here, walked across this ridge and swale topography, ended up building a relationship between what the elevation was on the floodplain versus how conductive the material was. And what we saw was a big difference between wells that were installed in sandy ridges versus the more fine textured low wells, the swales. And if you looked at the texture, according to the low wells or high wells are, again, lower topographic position in the swales, you see that those contain a fair bit of fine textured material of silt and clay. If you're on a ridge, they're typically all sand, and so they're overwhelmingly sand. So if you look at the difference between just the texture of the low and high wells, this is going to translate water quality. So this is again, a series of box plots between the sandy ridges and the low silty swales. So first off, you can see third one on the right is DO. So the high wells with a lot of sand have high dissolved oxygen in the groundwater. The swales right next to them have very low dissolved oxygen. You could see in other cases like dissolved organic carbon, DOC, much higher levels of DOC in the low wells compared to the high wells. So what we've learned from this effort was that there's a lot of spatial heterogeneity in these floodplains, and it's not one uniform system. It really depends on where you are. Are you in a sandy ridge or a silty swale? And we mapped these conditions at the Swamp White Oak site, and really we came up with a map of biogeochemical hotspots. And these are the locations where we see conditions favorable for denitrification of nitrate that may arrive with floodwater or whatever. So this groundwater quality beneath natural floodplains exhibits a lot of spatial heterogeneity and this patchiness. People have been long pointed out how patchy surface processes are in floodplains, like vegetation patterns and so forth. What we've seen here in this work was showing that groundwater is similarly patchy in that it's not one unique condition. It really does vary a lot in a floodplain. Well, we talked about floodplains in kind of a background natural state. What about flooding? This is myself. I'm out at the site here at a couple wells during a flood condition. So water had encroached into the floodplain from the Cedar River. We installed these geochemical zones made by YSI into the shallow wells. And what we found, these zones will measure all sorts of parameters like every 5 minutes. And so we put it in the well during a flood event. Shown on the left is essentially where it's green, or I'm sorry, where it's blue. That's where the surface water was at the ground surface. You see, it's like it wasn't a complete inundation, but it did cover the location where we had a shallow well. And the graph on the right shows essentially what the groundwater geochemistry was doing over a 2-week period after the flood. So what's interesting is that it varied a lot. Okay, so the dark black line is water depth. Well, that slowly diminished. Surface water infiltrated into the groundwater system. But as it was doing it, the dissolved oxygen crashed because we're consuming a lot of this organics that were brought into the flood. Temperature had a really interesting diurnal pattern because of the surface water warming, discharging into the groundwater. So this little event showed that how dynamic the water table was in a floodplain. And then we went out in 2008. This was a massive flood. It completely inundated the site. This is a series of fills, essentially, to show how the floodwater entered the site and filled it. Eventually, it was all up underwater. This is just the time when we were out there actually canoeing around. This was the situation that we had when we were out there in a boat. We did install these geochemical zones there again, and without going into great detail, we had zones in a high well and a low well. And over the course of this flood period, look at the variability in groundwater that you'd see across this system, dissolved oxygen rising and falling, or the redox condition, the geochemical stability changed a ton, pH, conductivity. It just shows how dynamic these floodplain systems are with the floodwater encroachment. We looked at water quality in the wells versus the floodwater. Nitrate in the floodwater was 4 to 6 milligrams per liter. We had very low, if poorly detectable, nitrate in the groundwater. So despite infiltrating water with 4 to 6 milligrams per liter of nitrate, there was no nitrate really measured in the shallow groundwater. It was consumed and processed so quickly with the floodwater. All right, well, that's a natural system, but as we know, people farm on floodplains. And why do they do that? Well, let's examine the motivation here a little bit. Floodplains are flat and they're relatively easy to farm. They contain high organic matter soils. They abundantly have a high soil moisture content. So during drought, floodplains are probably the best yielding agricultural land on a farm. And further, USDA farm programs actually provide insurance that reduces any negative consequence. So you potentially get your best ground and there's no consequence if it floods because you get insurance payment. So that's why we farm on floodplains. And interesting, the alluvial soils on floodplains, they develop really quickly. They set up they're frequently inundated. They get replenished with nutrients and sediments. So unlike upland soils that are constantly getting eroded, floodplain soils are constantly getting built up and added. So it's a very different system compared to upland erosion. So this is about a mile south of, excuse me, sorry for the dog interaction. Hopefully you can bear with me. He's got something outside he's looking at. You can see this is a high, sorry, time out 1 second. Did you take them out?
Stacy's not the only one who has problems with their dogs.
I know. Sorry, I gotta move him. This is a site located about a mile south of that Swamp White Oak site. And what's interesting here, this is another LiDAR elevation map, only this is kind of with coded differently, so you can see kind of the shading on the topography. And you see again all that ridge and swale topography, and then there's this area of flat in the middle of this floodplain with all this variability. Well, that flat area was a farm. So the farming essentially removed all this topographic heterogeneity and leveled it all out. Well, we worked with the TNC and put some wells in this system, and we looked at the differences between, and just to quickly go through this, we had another 3-year period. It's on the 2-year floodplain, so you expected some level of flooding. In 2011 and 2012, it was really pretty dry. The Cedar River stage is on the bottom, and the dashed line shows when the water gets above that level in the stage, there's a flood. And you kind of see in 2013, we had some big floods occur in the Cedar River. The water table depth, it's under, and then the red and blue again show depth below ground surface of about 1 to 2 meters. And then the water table went above the ground surface in 2013. So it's a very dynamic system. And as expected, we had flooding 1 out of those 3 years, serious flooding. And no crop was planted in 2013. So here are the water quality variations over the 3-year period. First year, that crop was in soybeans. There was a little bit of phosphate applied. Nitrate concentrations were very low. There was no measurement of really any nitrate anywhere. In 2012, that cropped area was planted in corn. NPK was applied, and it was side dressed with 220 pounds of liquid N. Nitrate concentrations crept up. And then the 3rd year, with the flood, it was a fallow year. There was just a cover crop planted. But nitrate concentrations in shallow groundwater just exploded under that crop field. They were upwards of 40 to 70 milligrams per liter, which is exceptionally high. So even though it was fallow that year, the year with the flooding, it retained the legacy of the fertilizer applied the year before and lost a ton of nitrate to shallow groundwater. The graph on the right just shows the increase in specific conductance, showing there's a little more salty as under the crop area that increased during this time period and decreased under the grass and the woods. So there was a water quality legacy of that floodplain farming from the corn rotation, which is, again, this is expected. It's a floodplain on a 2-year floodplain. It's going to flood fairly frequently, but this is the consequence of farming in a floodplain. I want to just bring in a couple watershed scale perspectives just to put the floodplain importance in context. This is a watershed in South Central Iowa. You can see the dark color coded there is the floodplain. And then it's a kind of a rolling countryside with upland, lush and till, and then shallow floodplain sands and gravels along the main channel. These are just continuous water level fluctuations. And what we see here, typical of everywhere, is a really narrow range of fluctuation in the floodplain because it stays wet all year round. And we see big changes in water table conditions in the uplands. So the uplands fluctuate 3 to 5 meters, and the floodplain stays at about 1 meter to 2 meters below ground surface. So very differences in water table behavior. If you looked at groundwater recharge, how much of infiltrating rainfall makes it to the water table? Here's a cross section through that area where we have silty, loss and till, and then sandy alluvium on the floodplain. Just a real simple diagram here, but in the floodplain, because we had shallow water table conditions, most of the infiltration recharged and reached the shallow groundwater. So in this case, 44% precip made it through the soils and recharged the groundwater. In contrast, in the uplands, only about 25% of that rainfall made it to water table. A lot of it was captured by soil moisture and filling up, you know, the reserves that way. So we see concentrated recharge in the floodplains. Here's another site in East Central Iowa, Clear Creek watershed, where we did something similar. We looked at monitoring wells in urban and suburban, perennial grass and row crop on an upland, side slope, and floodplain landscape position. And we looked at how much annual recharge, groundwater recharge, occurred. In this case, the floodplain was about 400 millimeters, and the upland was 250, and the side slopes were less because they had more water directed over surface runoff as opposed to infiltration. So we see differences in recharge, but if you put the nitrate concentrations on those, and it really translates to differences in nitrate loading from these different environments. So the uplands with that recharge and a higher concentration of nitrate could have had about 27 kilogram per hectare of nitrate from these row crop systems on the uplands. On the other hand, there was almost 42 kilograms per hectare in the floodplain. So the floodplain had 40% more nitrogen loading compared to the uplands and way more than the side slopes. We see the same thing in terms of phosphorus, which is our other dominant nutrient here in Iowa. Back to the Walnut Creek watershed, we did a study where we looked at groundwater orthophosphorus, this dissolved form of phosphorus in groundwater. And we see the upland groundwater concentration at 0.05, 50 parts per billion in upland, and 110 part per billion or 0.11 milligram per liter in the floodplain. You look at the differences in recharge, we essentially have 3 times more phosphorus loading occurring on the floodplains than the uplands. So it becomes really important to think about how we manage floodplains. They receive more recharge, and because of that recharge, they get more concentrated nutrient loading at times. So how much cropping is done in Iowa watersheds? These are Huck 12 watersheds. They're kind of like a 25 to 50 square mile watersheds. And if you looked at all of Iowa, there's over 1,500 of these. And you can see the area of floodplain farming that occurred, almost 8,000 square kilometers. On average, every one of these watersheds contains about 6% of their land area with row crop in the floodplain. And that fraction actually increases up to 20% in some. You can see from the accumulated plot here. So up to some watersheds have 20% of land area devoted to cropping in floodplains. Across the Mississippi River Basin, you can see Iowa, that's all the states, and their what fraction of these Huck 12 watersheds contain row crop in the floodplain. There's Iowa at over 4%. That's as much or more than most of the other states. Some states are better about managing floodplains for farming versus others, but it's not a unique case, you know. So Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, so forth, they all have, you know, say 2 to 6% of their land area in a watershed devoted to floodplain farming. One other example here from eastern Iowa. This is the English River. It's a slightly larger basin in eastern Iowa. We've got great maps in Iowa where we have mapped the all the floodplain inundations, 2, 5, 10, 25, 50, 100, 100, and 500-year occurrence intervals. So very detailed. And we can clip out how much row crop is in each different floodplain inundations in Iowa. And what it turns out, if you look at the English River example, that 1%, well, it's 50% of the land in the 100-year floodplain is in crop. That's really very high. And 28% of the land in the 2-year floodplain is in crop. So a little less than farming intensity, but that 28% of the 2-year floodplain is only 3% of the watershed area. In other words, if we wanted to take out 3% of the watershed and convert it back to native floodplain, it's not a big, Okay, it's only 3% of the watershed, and you can gain serious benefits. We examined this at another watershed in west central Iowa. This is the Raccoon River watershed, and more specifically, the South Raccoon, where we did a watershed model. And we looked at converting land from highly erodible crop ground, HEL is highly erodible land, versus crop ground conversion of alluvial soils in the floodplain. And we're curious, what bang for your buck could you get from converting HEL ground, vulnerable crop ground on slopes, versus conversion of crop ground on alluvial soils and floodplains? And not to go into all the details here, but let's look at a couple columns and rows. So we convert the highly erodible land to CRP grassland. It's a 36% conversion, which is a lot of ground in that Raccoon River watershed. We did the same conversion of alluvial soils to CRP, it's about 12%. But then you think about how much nitrate reduction you might see. Well, you get to convert 36% of the ground in the slopes to gain 28% or 29% reduction in nitrate. On the other hand, which is a negative, and again, on the other hand, it's a positive ratio for the alluvial soil. So we convert 12% of the ground to from percent reduction. So converting alluvial soils from row crop to CRP resulted in nearly 1.7 times more nitrate load reduction than converting land on sloping, highly erodible lands. A couple more things here just to highlight a little bit. We've also done a lot of work on oxbow lakes. Oxbows are essentially those, as the river is migrating, they begin to be really sinuous and winding, and occasionally high energy will kind of cut off one of these sinuous oxbows and create a lake that forms. We've been interested in trying to understand how these oxbow lakes can be used for additional nitrate processing. We did some work here in north central Iowa on an oxbow restoration. And you can see the reference down there. There's several papers that I've written on this topic. But in this case, a couple of tiles discharged into this oxbow lake. And we saw 44 to 47% of the nitrate removed from that input tile in the oxbow lake itself. And at a cost of roughly, for this restoration, of $10,000 to $15,000, we got a similar benefit to what you might expect from bioreactors or saturated buffers. Plus, you get a lot of ecosystem services in oxbow restoration. So we had another site in eastern Iowa where you could see the scar in the June 16 picture. It was excavated with the help of the Fish and Wildlife Service into an oxbow lake. And this was a case where it only received floodwater inputs of nitrogen. We installed a Nitrotax sensor to measure high resolution nitrate in that oxbow. And what we saw was during a flood event, the oxbow concentration from the floodwater increased to over 5 milligrams per liter. And over the course of 3 weeks, all that nitrate was processed. And we went from 5.3 to less than 1 after that flood pulse brought in that nitrate. So these are very active dynamic systems, not just in groundwater. The oxbows are also adding that feature. So I've highlighted the water benefits, both quantity and quality benefits of floodplains, but clearly floodplains have other important functions. So they provide a storage area for floodwaters, they dissipate the energy of the flood flows. They, of course, provide a source of organic matter to a lot of organisms, and they contribute to improved fisheries. Our Iowa DNR had a big fish tagging program, and they on the Wapsie River in eastern Iowa, and they actually were able to track some of this northern pike out into the floodplain. So that's just a productive fisheries. These floodplains are connected to their uh, rivers are connected to floodplains. So floodplains is conservation targets with perennial vegetation. Floodplains utilize water and nutrients during longer non-flood periods, but are particularly active during flood periods, and they reduce nutrient delivery to rivers. They exhibit spatial heterogeneity, both in the groundwater and the subsurface, but all of the important habitat and biodiversity, making them important hotspots for nutrient processing. They provide important ecosystem services that I'll rely more on all of you to quantify. And as much as we want these natural systems, many watersheds in Iowa and across the Midwest contain, up to 20% of the land area in a basin. In floodplains, and many of these floodplains are cropped. So that's it's an opportunity for conservation targeting. Groundwater recharge and nutrient loss is concentrated on floodplains, and agricultural nutrients are stored and are lost during vulnerable flooding and post-flooding periods. Therefore, all of those bullets lead to this. Floodplains, I believe, are really low-hanging fruit for conservation opportunities, not just in Iowa and the Midwest, but across the country and the world. We need to reconnect our rivers to floodplains and let floodplains do what they're going to do in terms of water and nutrients. So I'm going to stop right here, and we can have some questions if you'd like. I think there's a few minutes left.
I have a question from Elaine. What are changes in flood events? Frequency, intensity, duration. Are you getting more flood events as the climate change increases?
That's the projection. Historically, it's been a little bit ambiguous on some of the changes we see. We see precipitation, larger precipitation events occur with a little greater frequency. If we look at annual maximum flows, they're not changing as much as we see annual low flows doing. So we see a lot more increase in our low flows and base flows than we do with maximum flows. On the other hand, all the projections suggest that we are going to see more and more high intensity rainfalls and more flooding. So I'm not sure history is our best guide on that. We're very, if we look ahead, I believe that's our future. And these floodplains are going to be very important for that.
Well, it looks like floodplains are better off where you have the CRP programs where things like corn are not grown. It's just disappointing to hear how much of the crop insurance gets paid to farmers. And this certainly will increase if there continue to be lots of corn grown in a floodplain. It's going to be a cost to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if we really even know the true cost, we know the cost of programs and so forth. And the amount of flood insurance payments that go out, there's the people track that, but really there's been less effort saying on the preventative side, what are you saving essentially by not cropping in floodplains, or what are you gaining more so than the payments out. And so, yeah, it's really when we've removed all the negative consequences, you really can't fault the agricultural producers for using these systems, because we've indemnified them of all the risk. I feel like there's a real farm program change needed for us to be able to start counting the benefits of floodplains.
Well, I think that's why Mike asked, should the Farm Bill remove crop insurance from the 2-year floodplain. He also asked about field drainage tiles removed.
Yeah, I totally am support removing flood insurance from 2-year floodplains. We can debate on other floodplain inundations if we want, but that is like I feel like it's a no-brainer that we should get out of the business of farming 2-year floodplains. If a producer wants to do it, go ahead, but you assume all risk. You know, there's no elimination of that or public financing of that risk. That's all on you. And so that's my thought. We don't necessarily need to regulate exactly how people use your land, but we're not going to eliminate the risk that you're making by using that ground. A lot of floodplains, they can be tile, but it's probably a little bit of a lost cause because the water tables are all shallow anyway. You know, sometimes they have they receive tile drainage, or they are tiled in many cases, but you know, again, it's the water table is only a meter or two down all the time, and they flood on a regular basis. So tiles that are there do a lot of work, but I'm not sure toward what end. Upland areas or prairie potholes and all those areas are, of course, extensively drained in Iowa, and all that water goes to our rivers, feeds our rivers, and that flow that's partially sourced to tiles is also the water that flows out on floodplains during floods. So it's all part of the kind of the same system in many ways. It's still the water from ag land getting in floodplains, but it might have been sourced a long ways ago from a tile, several counties to the north.
He also asked if you have thoughts on mandatory stream buffers.
Yeah, I would be in favor of that as well. It's like, I keep looking for low-hanging fruit. That's an easy one too. I just understand what the positive payoff is for not having a buffer. Really, it's very vulnerable land to erosion. It has a lot of ecosystem benefits. Really, what are you gaining out by farming areas that could be in a buffer? I mean, it seems like all risk and very little reward. It seems, so just as a cost benefit thing, I just don't understand why there's so much reluctance to do that.
Well, we have learned a lot from all your studies. And
I just was wondering, I know you talked about this and you kind of just said it in one sentence. So I want to kind of highlight this because I came up to you the last time you had a presentation and kind of asked the same question about the responses you get when you, as a scientist, you know it all, say floodplains are better at taking up nitrogen than bioreactors. And we're spending, I don't know if we've reached the $1 million mark on bioreactors in Iowa yet, but we're spending lots of money on them.
Yeah, I think it's sometimes, especially if you get ag engineers involved, and engineers want to engineer, and so they're looking for this mechanical engineering solution to this problem, where I think it could be a lot more of a natural solution, more so than this engineered solution. So it's a little bit depends on who you talk to, but the benefits of floodplains, and we've seen this with the oxbow restorations, is that it brings along just so many ecosystem services that you don't get from burying a bioreactor in the ground, So we've seen a lot of producers come forward with oxbow restorations because they want to have, land available for a pond, or even from hunting or fishing or whatever. Everybody loves a pond on the ground, and most of the time these floodplains are vulnerable anyway, and this is a chance to get some ecological or even recreational value on marginal land. So I think in terms of the totality of potential benefits. I just feel like the floodplains offer so much more than, an engineered solution, like with a bioreactor saturated buffer, which is an engineering solution to one problem instead of a comprehensive solution to a lot of problems.
Doris, can you see the chat?
Elaine has her hand up.
Yeah, we got 2 more questions. Keith, can't go yet.
Okay.
Who's first? Let's go. Okay, I'm not a scientist, I am a mathematician, so I looked at all your numbers really carefully. But if all of the nutrient pollution is going into groundwater, it's still pollution, and this is maybe a naive question, but isn't that harmful somewhere along the hydrological cycle that it's in the groundwater now?
Yes, for sure. And think about the groundwater is the natural discharge of that groundwater without pumping is going to be to streams and rivers. So really, it is part of the hydrologic cycle that you might see recharge in the floodplain with high nitrate. That nitrate stays in the groundwater, flows naturally to the river, and discharges as base flow in the river. So it is a kind of a cycle. And then at times, folks will install shallow pumping wells for their community or
Right?
farmstead in these alluvial systems. And of course, they are extremely vulnerable to the pollution.
So the pollution, it doesn't disappear or it's not mitigated in a sense, and so it goes back into a system like shallow wells where people could end up drinking it.
Right. But one of the things I wanted to point out in this presentation was there is a natural process of denitrification that will take nitrate, the oxidized form, and then convert it through microbial respiration to nitrogen gas. So these systems that have these swales and this organic matter and kind of low dissolved oxygen conditions are kind of like natural, almost natural bioreactors, because they can take that groundwater with high nitrate and essentially it becomes food for the bugs to convert it to and breathe out nitrogen gas. So
Okay.
it is a loss in some cases. If it's in that sand and gravel of the system, there are not those kind of opportunities. And then nitrate is just going to be like a conservative tracer in those systems. But where we see the conditions right, you can get substantial denitrification, which is one real reason to think about trying to encourage river flows to connect with floodplains during flood events, is because you can deliver high nitrate water to the floodplain. It soaks in through this organic rich material, gets denitrified, and eventually becomes essentially a treatment. So your flood water, as that water cycles back to the river, it's going to contain lower nitrate than it was when it first entered the floodplain.
I thought you made that point really good when you presented your information. You didn't have a lot of fancy graphs or anything, but you did talk about some work you've done with different plants that are on the floodplain and how they impact the amount of nitrogen that's taken up through this natural denitrification process.
Right. So it's definitely, we could debate all the benefits of different perennial vegetation, but perennial wins. So whether it's, trees in a savanna like the swamp white oak, or even as something as negative as like green canary grass. Well, anything perennial is going to do the work. If we get cropland, it becomes extremely vulnerable. And of course, if we pave over it, we get no communication whatsoever with the floodplain sediments. So you know, I would rank all perennial and some perennials a lot better than others. Winning what we should do in floodplains, cropping, not so much at all. And then urbanization and pavement, you know, you just eliminated all potential benefits of floodplains at that point.
And haven't you found the trees do the best?
Yes. In terms of water uptake, absolutely. And long-term nutrient storage, you know, it's not a permanent storage. Trees will, you know, die and degrade and so forth. But for sequestering water and nutrients, I would consider trees the probably the most consequential.
Another question is, what can you tell us about floodplains and phosphorus removal?
Yeah, that one is a little bit, that's definitely trickier because, you know, phosphorus can be attached to soil particles. And so you get sedimentation in floodplains, and that's essentially a phosphorus removal from the river system. But phosphorus will get taken up a little bit by the vegetation, but they don't need all that much compared to other water and nitrogen and other nutrients. And then from other work I've had is that, you know, in these low anaerobic environments, we could actually lose some phosphorus through transformation from that total phosphorus of the particulates into the dissolved fraction. So you could sometimes have higher concentrations of dissolved phosphorus in a floodplain than you might normally expect. But as a general rule, you know, again, if you're trapping sediment in a naturally functioning floodplain, that is going to remove phosphorus from the river system. So if we're concerned about downstream eutrophication, like the Gulf of Mexico or other water bodies, the more we can get rivers to interact with their floodplains, slow that water up and drop that excess sediment on floodplains, it's going to be better for the downstream water bodies.
Well, this is all the questions that I have seen, and we are scheduled to end our webinar soon. But I certainly thank you. I learned a lot today, and it's been very helpful.
Well, it's my pleasure. So I'm, for Debbie's sake, I'm glad that we got a chance to see these visuals that we talked about last time. So thanks for the opportunity, and yeah, look forward to any future interactions you might want to pursue.
Thank you.
Yeah, with scientists like you and David, there's hope for Iowa.
Yes,
I agree. Yes, I wish we had you in Washington State.
Yeah, there's a lot of good folks out there. They seem to sometimes get to be marginalized compared to other louder voices, that's for sure.
Well, this has been our spring event. We try to do these things just for a couple hours on a weekend, and we'll do them again in the future. So thank all our presenters.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Water Affordability team.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone. This was awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.